Most people know that 6 million Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. What far fewer people know is that millions of Slavic civilians were also killed under Nazi rule, through mass shootings, deliberate starvation, forced labor, and occupation policies that treated them as racially inferior. In parts of Eastern Europe, entire villages were erased. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war were deliberately starved to death. Polish, Belarusian, Ukrainian, Serbian, and other Slavic populations were targeted for displacement, enslavement, or elimination. This is not about comparing suffering, and it is not about diminishing the Holocaust. It is about understanding that Nazi racial ideology extended beyond anti-Semitism. It included a broader hierarchy, one that ranked many Slavic peoples as expendable. And that hierarchy did not appear out of nowhere. For centuries, Slavic populations were portrayed as backward, primitive, less civilized, or destined to be ruled. From medieval associations with enslavement, to 19th century racial theories that ranked Europeans against one another, to geopolitical narratives that framed Eastern Europe as Europe's less developed half, a pattern formed. A pattern of internal European hierarchy. Today, Slavic nations are generally categorized as white, and because of that classification, anti-Slavic racism is often overlooked in modern discussions of race. But being labeled white has not always meant equal status within global power structures. In contemporary global hierarchies, Western Europe and North America often occupy the top tier of perceived modernity and legitimacy. Eastern and Southeastern Europe are frequently framed as peripheral, as economically weaker, politically unstable, culturally behind. Stereotypes about corruption, cheap labor, criminality, or backwardness continue to circulate in media and public discourse. These narratives shape migration patterns, labor markets, and social status. They influence how Eastern European workers are treated abroad. They affect how entire nations are perceived on the global stage. The echoes of older hierarchies are still present, not in the same form, not in the same intensity, but present. Understanding anti-Slavic racism is not about rewriting history. It is about recognizing that racial hierarchies can exist even within groups that are broadly categorized as the same race. When we simplify Europe into a single white category, we lose sight of the layered inequalities that have shaped its past and continue to influence its present. In this video, we will explore the historical roots of anti-Slavic racism, trace how it evolved across centuries, and examine why its legacy still matters today. Because awareness is not division, it is clarity. Let's begin. To understand anti-Slavic racism, we first need to understand who the Slavs were and where they came from. The Slavs did not suddenly appear in medieval Europe. They emerged gradually as a linguistic and cultural group somewhere in Eastern or Central Europe during late antiquity. Most historians place the early Slavic homeland in a region north of the Black Sea and around parts of modern-day Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus. By the 6th century, Byzantine sources begin referring to groups called the Sklaveni and the Antes. These were not unified nations in the modern sense. They were tribal confederations, decentralized, fluid, and mobile. Between the 6th and 9th centuries, Slavic-speaking groups expanded rapidly across Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe. Some moved into the Balkans, others into Central Europe, others eastward into what would later become Russia. This expansion did not happen in isolation. It occurred in a region defined by collapsing empires, shifting frontiers, and constant warfare. And this geopolitical instability matters, because instability produces captives. Early medieval Europe operated partly on raiding economies. War was not only political, it was economic. Captives were taken and sold. Human beings were integrated into long-distance trade networks stretching from northern Europe to the Mediterranean and beyond. Slavic-speaking regions, located along volatile frontier zones between major powers, the Byzantine Empire, the Frankish realms, steppe confederations, were frequently exposed to raids. Over time, people from these regions became overrepresented in certain slave markets. And here, something linguistically significant happened. In medieval Latin, the term sclavus began to be used for enslaved people. The word derived from Slav. Over centuries, this term evolved into the word slave in many European languages. This does not mean that all slaves were Slavs. It does not mean that Slavs were uniquely enslaved. Slavery in this period affected many ethnic groups across Europe, Africa, and Asia. But when the name of a people becomes entangled with the word for bondage, it creates a lasting semantic association. An ethnonym becomes a status word, and once language encodes that association, it becomes easier, generations later, to imagine that group as naturally subordinate. Not because of biology, not yet because of race, but because of repetition, economy, and power. At this stage, we are not yet dealing with racial ideology. What we are seeing is the first structural layer: frontier violence plus economic extraction plus linguistic transformation. And this layer will quietly influence how Slavic peoples are perceived in later centuries.
By the 11th century, Europe was changing. Power was consolidating. Kings were strengthening their authority. The Latin Church was expanding its institutional control. And along the eastern frontier of Europe, a major transformation began. In 1147, during what is known as the Wendish Crusade, German and Danish forces launched military campaigns against Slavic-speaking pagan groups along the Baltic coast. This was not just war. It was framed as a crusade, a religious mission. Conversion and conquest became intertwined. At the same time, something quieter but equally powerful was happening. Beginning in the 12th century and accelerating in the 13th, large numbers of settlers from the Holy Roman Empire moved eastward into Slavic-speaking lands. This process is known as Ostsiedlung, the eastward settlement. Here's what that meant in practice. German settlers were invited, sometimes by Slavic rulers themselves, to found towns. These towns were often granted Magdeburg law, a legal system that provided urban autonomy, commercial privileges, and structured governance. Cities like Kraków, Wrocław, and many towns in Bohemia and the Baltic region adopted these legal frameworks. The legal language was German. The administrative culture was German. The merchant class was often German-speaking. This did not mean immediate ethnic replacement. But it did mean something structural. Power began to align with specific institutions: urban charters, guild membership, trade networks, clerical positions. Over time, Slavic-speaking rural populations were frequently excluded from these urban privileges. They remained peasants. The towns became centers of economic growth. The countryside became economically subordinate. In the Baltic region, the Teutonic Order provides an even clearer example. In the 13th century, the Teutonic Knights launched campaigns against Prussian and other Baltic peoples. These were military conquests justified as Christianization. Land was seized. Fortified towns were built. German settlers were brought in. Local populations were subordinated or displaced. Here, the causal chain becomes visible. Christianization campaigns plus military conquest plus legal transplantation create institutional asymmetry. Those inside the legal framework of the expanding power gain privilege. Those outside it appear less organized, less developed, less legitimate. And perception begins to shift. Slavic-speaking peasants are not just different. They are increasingly framed as less urbanized, less literate, less politically structured, even though these conditions are largely produced by who controls land and law. EU saw when towns, written law codes, guild systems, and church administration align with one group. That group begins to appear more civilized. When another group is structurally confined to rural labor, that group begins to appear backward, not because of biology, not because of inherent inferiority, but because institutional access shapes perception. By the end of the 13th century, this hierarchy is no longer just linguistic. It is embedded in land ownership, in urban charters, in military orders, in clerical administration. Difference has become structural, and once hierarchy becomes structural, it becomes easier, in later centuries, to reinterpret it as natural. This is the moment when otherness begins turning into ranked civilization, and that ranking will grow sharper in the age of nationalism. By the 16th century, Europe was no longer a patchwork of small frontier zones. It was dominated by large composite empires: the Habsburg monarchy, the Ottoman Empire, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the expanding Muscovite state. Each ruled over vast territories. Each governed populations speaking multiple languages, practicing different religions, and living under different legal traditions. And that scale created a new problem: predictability. Empires need taxes, they need soldiers, they need loyalty. But when you rule over dozens of ethnic and religious groups, complexity becomes a threat. So rulers simplify, they categorize, they reduce populations into administratively manageable types. In the Ottoman Empire, which by the 16th century controlled much of the Balkans, identity was officially organized through the millet system. Communities were classified primarily by religion: Orthodox Christians, Catholics, Muslims, Jews. But over time, religion, language, and ethnicity blurred together in administrative thinking. Orthodox Christians in the Balkans, many of them South Slavs, were taxed differently. They were subject to specific legal distinctions. In frontier regions, they were sometimes treated as potentially disloyal, especially during wars with Habsburg powers. Religion became a proxy for political reliability, and ethnicity became entangled with religion. On the Habsburg side, similar dynamics emerged. After repeated wars with the Ottoman Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Habsburgs created the military frontier, a buffer zone stretching across parts of modern Croatia and Serbia. Local populations, many of them South Slavs, were settled there in exchange for military service. They were granted land, but governed directly by military administration. Not by normal civil law. This was not just geography, it was categorization. Frontier Slavs were seen as useful warriors, but also as populations requiring supervision. Loyal, but conditional. In the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, hierarchy hardened along class and ethnic lines. The szlachta, the noble class, dominated politics. Peasants, many of them Ruthenian or other Slavic populations in eastern territories, were increasingly bound into serfdom by the 16th century. Here, ethnicity merged with class. Rural Slavic populations became structurally associated with agricultural labor and political exclusion. Over time, peasant and Eastern began to overlap in perception. Meanwhile, Muscovy, later the Russian state, expanded eastward across Eurasia. As it incorporated new populations, administrative categories again became tools of governance. Groups were classified by loyalty, faith, tax status, and military obligation. Ethnicity became linked to political reliability. Across all these empires, a pattern repeats. Frontier wars create insecurity. Confessional conflict, Catholic versus Orthodox versus Muslim, intensifies suspicion. Class systems harden, and identity becomes bundled. Religion, language, political loyalty, economic role, compressed into simplified administrative categories. Empire-scale governance requires simplification. Simplification turns fluid identities into rigid labels. Rigid labels become stereotypes, and stereotypes become policy shortcuts. In this period, Slav is no longer just a linguistic identity. Depending on the region, it can mean frontier soldier, taxable peasant, religious outsider, potential rebel. The meaning shifts by empire, but the pattern is consistent. Identity becomes tied to suspicion, measured emphasis. When loyalty is questioned and identity becomes the shortcut for trust, hierarchy deepens, not yet in fully racial terms, but politically, administratively, structurally.